being here, and I'll let you introduce yourself in terms of a non-scientist and loves animals and
Yeah. Whoa, I'm back. All right. So I'm sorry if the title was a little misleading. We're talking about the plight of multiple penguins, not just one. And we'll talk. First, show of hands. Who's seen a penguin in the wild? Yeah. Who's been to Antarctica before? Couple of you. Nice. Well, if nothing else, hopefully you'll leave here with a little bit more knowledge about penguins and the desire to go to Antarctica. I put up this quote. I didn't actually say the author. I'll talk about him a little bit more later, but he's absolutely Cherry Gerard. He was one of the first people down in Antarctica sort of do some rudimentary science on penguins. He's an absolute legend of an explorer. So now I'll introduce myself a little bit as a guide. My favorite subject is, of course, myself. So I'll try and keep this one brief. That's me, and those are king penguins, which we're not going to talk too much about. I am not a scientist, so I do want to put that out there right now. I'm just a naturalist and an animal lover, and I'm here to convey some science that have been done by people who've spent much more time down in Antarctica than myself. But yeah, so it was originally kind of a love of animal that got me into this naturalist guide educator career I've been embarking on. I first started working on a whale watching boat when I was about 18 years old. I volunteered for my local aquarium as a docent naturalist, and then here I am now driving whale watching boats for Gastineau here in Juneau many years later, still looking at whales and wildlife. But you know, a few years in, I just kept getting these people, and I would be out on this whale watching boat and I'd be like, wow, look at this beautiful blue whale, and this person would be like, yeah, but what's that small flying brown object? And at first I was like, wow, that's interesting, and then later I realized that this was going to keep happening to me in my career. So I kind of, when I was young, I loved all animals, and at one stage it was birds, so I learned all about the birds in my area, and then as I got older, it morphed more into marine animals as I was living down by the ocean in Southern California. And then so I went back towards birds as I realized that I needed to have this knowledge for the people who were on my trips and tours. And now here we are 18 years later, and I'm driving whale watching boats, and everyone's looking at the whale, and I'm like, oh my gosh, look, a long-tailed duck. Yeah, and I've spent some time with penguins here the last couple of years. I've been working down in Antarctica, predominantly as a sea kayak guide, but that was just the first way I could get down to Antarctica. It was sort of always my dream and goal once I found out that was a reality to get down there, and sea kayaking was sort of my avenue. So. We'll start a little bit by talking about the penguins of the world. There are 18 penguins the world over, okay? The little blues, sometimes people want to say there's 19. There was an argument that the little blues were genetically different enough down in Australia, and actually even on the Banks Peninsula of New Zealand from the rest of the population. But they're all down to one now. You got the Galapagos, the African, the Magellanic, and the Humboldt. These guys are all kind of spread around the southern end of their respective continents, except for this Galapagos guy. He's sort of the anomaly, so most people will say, well, penguins are in the southern hemisphere and polar bears are in the northern hemisphere and they'll never cross, and then someone will invariably always say, yeah, but the Galapagos penguins in the northern hemisphere. And that's kind of true. They follow the cold Humboldt waters up to the Galapagos, but they don't normally cross the hemisphere. Anywho, then we've got all these guys, the crested penguins, which include the yellow-eye. This is the rarest of all of the penguins right there. He lives in New Zealand. New Zealand actually has the world's highest number of different penguin species, at least the country that has the highest number of them. And unfortunately, they live kind of right around the mainland and the southern portion of the South Island, and because that's also fairly nice real estate for humans and farmland, a lot of their populations have dropped. Then we have the brushtails, the Adelie, the chinstrap, the Gentoo, and we're going to talk a lot more about these guys. But that's kind of a bit of the spread of penguins around the world. And this is a really important one that I like to talk about. People always associate penguins and Antarctica. Only really 2 of the penguin species are only solely found on Antarctica. Okay? All of the rest of those 18 that we talked about are distributed around this ring, what is usually called the subantarctic islands. You'll see New Zealand up there on the top, Probably a Kiwi who made this infographic. They're up there high. But they've got tons of different ones, including the Snares penguin, which is only found on Snares Island. That's all. South Georgia's probably, for this portion of the subantarctic island, South Georgia is really the crown jewel for birding. If it is not on your list of places in this world to go, it should probably be just about the top. South Georgia is absolutely mind-blowing. So let's talk now a little bit about Antarctica. So in particular, you saw that title was the Peninsula's Penguins. Antarctica is a massive continent. Don't be confused by the Mercator projection. That's why I wanted to show this one, which is a bit more of is a better graphic representation of Antarctica. I want you guys to notice that the little peninsula, this little bit that sticks out up here, you'll see how much closer it is to the rest of land than anywhere else. So that's the most visited part of the entire Antarctica, or the continent of Antarctica. And that's because boats can easily make it from the bottom of South America there across the Drake Passage and over to the peninsula. It takes about 2 days. Depends on how you find the Drake. It can be a wonderful, lovely ride, like the Inside Passage, or it can be just absolute bedlam. If you look kind of around how far it is from the bottom of South Africa, how far it is from Australia, how far it is from New Zealand, it's somewhere between a 5 to 8 day boat ride from any of those places. So the majority of the people who ever see Antarctica will only see the peninsula, they'll only see this western portion right here. And this is a really unique feature. This is called the polar front. I think in science they're trying to do away with that. You see this little dotted line that cruises all around Antarctica. So when Antarctica broke away from all of the rest of the landmass, the last part that it was sort of connected to was down here in South America. And when that broke free and wandered down to the bottom of the world, you had this ocean current that popped up. And it's often, I think it's now being called the Antarctic Convergence. Also, you'll still see it as the polar front. And now that winds around. You can see the arrow in the direction it goes, the Antarctic Convergence right there. And it sort of isolates Antarctica from the rest of the water and currents in the world's oceans. Okay, so none of the water from up here, this warmer water, penetrates down into there. And so when it broke free and that circumpolar current started forming, that's when Antarctica became really, really cold and caked in ice and snow, which covers over 90, I think 97 or 98% of the land of Antarctica is just ice. And so that's a really important feature because a lot of animals won't cross that either. So the critters that live up here stay up here, and the critters that are down in there stay down there, with the exception of a few different species of whales and some of the albatrosses and tube noses. So here's just another look at the Antarctic Peninsula as it kind of stretches up. When we're very specifically talking, when we start to talk about kind of the population changes in some of these penguins, we're talking about this area, the western portion of the Antarctic Peninsula. It's fairly unique as far as Antarctica goes. All right, so I mentioned this already, Antarctic penguins. That's pretty much just the emperor, who we're not going to talk about. I'm sorry, we're not talking about emperor penguins today. Is everyone okay with that? The door's right there if you're not, all right. We're talking mainly about these cute, adorable, ridiculous little things over here to the left, and these are called Adelis. These are the two true Antarctic penguins. But along the peninsula, we get another 2 species of the brushtails, and that's only been really recently that they've started showing up. So brush-tailed penguins, that's these 3 right here. So the Adelie is the furthest right, the middle is the chin strap, and the far left is the Gentoo. Before tonight, has anyone ever heard of these guys? Some yes, some maybe not. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit more about them. Now we could give an entire presentation just probably solely about any of these guys and the differences between the 3 of them, but I want to sort of start with a basis so that you guys are familiar with these guys. Adelie penguins, they're named after, I cannot remember the name of the explorer. Jacob, do you remember? No, I think it was No, it wasn't Charcot. Anyway, they were named after this gentleman's wife. Same with Adelaide or Adelie Island. And they feed predominantly on krill, but they'll also take lanternfish and squid and amphipods and such things. These are the kind of main ones we're going to be talking about. They nest really early in the season, and they like to find barren ground and rock. They cannot lay their nests or their eggs directly on the snow, so if there's a lot of snow down there, or if it continues to snow down there, these ones are in particular trouble. And in winter, they forage right along the sea ice edge. And it's important for them because they need to be able to pop back up and rest on the sea ice, whereas some of the other species we're going to talk about can do a lot better while swimming much longer distances and staying out in the water for a longer period of time. These guys are the gentoos. These are now becoming some of the most commonly found of the brushtails. So they're the largest of them. And one of the really important things, we'll visit this later, is they can lay a second clutch. So they can lay eggs a second time in the season if their first clutch fails, and that's one of the really big benefits to these guys. They're relatively unknown in the Western Peninsula until the 90s. In fact, they had never even really seen them there, but we'll talk a bit more later about a gentleman, Ron Naveen, and then another fellow, Bill Fraser, who's been studying these guys very specifically. But they're some of the most adaptable of the penguins. So if they were not living down in the peninsula until just recently, where were they living? Both these guys and these guys, the chin straps, they live a lot in a series of islands that are just off of the peninsula, as well as substantially further north. They're found in the Falklands. They're also found in South Georgia. They're found really close to the tip of South America, so substantially further north in areas that are not normally covered by ice. Oh, chin strap penguins. I mean, what's not to love? That ridiculous thing. They're so absurd. They're also newcomers in quotes, but they've been down there for about 50 to 70 years, whereas these gentoos we just spoke about, they were just seen like 30 years and no sooner than that. So these guys kind of found their way down to the peninsula a little bit before them. They particularly like to nest on these really steep rocky outcrops, and it's really mind-blowing because you'll be coming up to the site and these things are just scaling these ridiculously steep snow banks and then up onto these rocky cliffs, and you look and you think they're going to fall down, and they seem to want to just be the tallest thing out there. They're really cute. And in some areas they're doing fairly well, and in other areas, especially Elephant Island, which is an island just off of the tip of the peninsula, their numbers have dropped by over 50%. Has anyone here heard of Elephant Island? Yeah, Shackleton's men were marooned on Elephant Island when he paddled himself across to South Georgia. So they feed on krill, lanternfish, squid, and assorted other invertebrates. So similar to the gentoos, because these guys haven't been locked down into Antarctica for quite as long as the adelies have, they've got a little bit more diverse of a feeding strategy, and that's one of the things that's helping them out. So that fellow Bill Fraser I mentioned, this is sort of his life's research here. I wish that we had more information about these kind of population changes than we do, but people have only been down there witnessing what's been going on for scientific purposes for about 50 years. Now you'll see over there that radiocarbon dating has been used. They found, I think, about 7 different defunct nesting sites that none of the penguins were using anymore. And so between using the bones, some beaks of squids, and some of the other detritus they were able to dig up, they radiocarbon dated and found that the adelies have been present in some of these sites for over 700 years with absolutely no sign or trace, not a singular animal, sorry, but like in general they've been there for quite some time, but no sign of gentoos or of our little chin strap friends. So scientists have been kind of banging their heads against the wall. They've really been trying to figure this out. Like, why has it been such a huge spike in gentoos, and why have the adelies so precipitously fallen off? And one of the things they're seeing is these chin straps. This is 2005 is when this chart was published, but are starting to go down as well, and they think the Gen2s might be out-competing the others in a process they're coining gentification. All right. Jacob, raise your hand. Yeah, that's right. He approached me this morning. It was all smiles, and he's like, "All right, I got a great joke for your talk." I cannot claim that one. That was that man right there. All right, stand up, take a bow, Come on. There you are. So all joking aside, this kind of paints the picture. This is really what they're thinking, is that you see the Adeles over here are standing on sea ice. These guys are hopping just off the rocks. It's a kind of a cute way of demonstrating how important the sea ice is to the Adeles, where these two have just come from regions of the world where sea ice really isn't even there, period. There is no sea ice. So they're not used to having to compete with the sea ice. They don't really care about it. They're able to feed without it. And you might notice, like, okay, well, there's sea ice in there, but the rest of it kind of looks pretty similar, and I know this thing ain't eating that whole crab, so what's going on? You'll notice the little krill-looking things, juvenile krill. We're going to spend a bit more time talking about things other than penguins in just a moment, and those things are krill. You did, or if you guys remember, I did mention that these little Gen2s can have a second clutch. This photo was actually taken last year, right at the end of the season, and they still had little babies. So they're not 100% sure how high the survival rate is of the young that are born in the second clutch, but it does give them a fighting chance, because, dun dun dun, the elephant in the room. How could you talk about Antarctica and not mention this? So let's talk about it. Yep, pretty blues, that means things are fairly normal. Yellow, that's relatively average, high temperature spikes. And then I want you guys to focus on this little section right here, especially towards the end. Once it starts getting into the red, these are temperature anomalies that are well above the normal. And so you're going to see in the past about 20 to 30, 40 years that the peninsula is warming substantially faster than other parts of Antarctica. And that has been particularly problematic for our Adeles. So what does that mean? Yes, it's warmer down there, but it actually means more precipitation. You guys may have heard that Antarctica is more or less the world's largest desert. It's really cold, it's not a hot desert, but there isn't a lot of precipitation. What's happening now is that as that water warms up and as the air temperatures warm up and that water or that air that is just circling around the Antarctic continent is carrying these storms, and they smash into either the Antarctic Peninsula or they go a little bit further and slam into the bottom of South America. And when they do, now there's so much more moisture in the warmer air that they are just detonating on the peninsula, and it's ending up being these major snowstorms, and the peninsula is now seeing way more precipitation than it ever did. This is problematic again because those Adeles, which are arriving early, and they need those barren rock scrapes to be able to have their eggs and have their little ones. A lot of the snowstorms are coming in, and then that snow starts to melt, and it's actually creating like a little rivulet and flooding out those nests, and that has really been problematic to the eggs. One of the things that we saw along the peninsula, the western side at least, is that most of the Adelie colonies that we visit regularly with these ships had complete, like, catastrophic failures of breeding events. Like, not even a single or only a few of the Adelie chicks had survived. So this is problematic. We're going to look at a slide. This one is pretty painful because this has been happening since between when we last left the Antarctic and when we'll be going down again this season. This is a photo or a satellite image of some of the ice charts that was taken this year. It was pretty big news around the Antarctic circles. This was the extent of sea ice around the peninsula in the middle of the winter. It was non-existent. Here, if you zoom into up there, you can see that there pretty much is no sea ice. And you'll see that the yellow line is the averages, right? And you'll see that there's normally not a huge amount around the western peninsula, yet they're still usually able to find ice down there, ice up there, and it's usually in the Bransfield Strait a fair bit of ice. And it didn't exist, so it's going to be really curious to see what happens this year. Headed back down in a couple of weeks for an early season. I've never been down there that early in the season, and it's going to be cold. It'll be really interesting to see how the penguins have fared. So krill. Ooh, this is another big one. So we talked, run over here so I'm out of the light. So we talked about how important krill is, especially to the Adelies, and how important that sea ice is. So you need sea ice for krill to be able to survive. So adults, when they come out here, yay, in the summer, and there's sun, and phytoplankton blooms, and the krills go nom 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 nom, phytoplankton. And then they have their eggs, and then their odd larval cycle, which I cannot pronounce. And then as they're in their juvenile form, they sit and they feed on phytoplankton, which lives right underneath the sea ice shelves. So when that sea ice is gone, there are no juvenile krill, which means there is no food for the Adelies, because this is what these guys particularly specialize in. So apart from needing that sea ice to just kind of like waddle out there and then jump in the water, it is critically important for those juvenile krill and for them to eat. So with sea ice being gone, this is really problematic for krill populations. Another big thing that has been problematic for krill populations is krill fishing. I got a surprise question. I did a chat with a gentleman down at K200, and he's like, what's something that the people the good people of Juneau can do from home to help combat this plight of the penguins? And my answer was, don't consume products containing krill oil. I know this isn't a huge problem for folks of Juneau because you guys have lots of fish in your diet. If you don't eat fish, you probably don't live in Juneau. But generally speaking, we have so much fish that we don't even think about the benefits of those fatty omega-3 or the omega-3 fatty acids. But they're being peddled through krill oil. And krill oil, I think it costs somewhere around like 8 to 10 times more than fish oil because of marketing, solely marketing. There's a large push to fish for krill in the Southern Ocean. Actually, no one really lays claim to it, and no one's down there patrolling, so you can get lots of krill, and then you can make money off it. So there was a huge push in the 80s and the 90s to try and make krill marketable, to find some way for humans to eat krill, for them to make krill appealing. And they failed, partly because it has a lot of iodine in it, and fluoride in it, that's the one. And so eventually they started pushing it in pills and oils and saying it was this next new health benefit, charging a pretty penny for it. But please don't buy krill. The whales need it, and dear Lord, do our little Adelies need it as well. There's one other thing in the world of competition for krill that a lot of people don't talk about, and it's the resurgence of whale populations in the world's oceans. So down, especially right around South Georgia and in the South Shetland Islands, there was a huge amount of whaling. They wiped out probably roughly 90% of the big whales down there during the 20s, 30s, 40s. And so when those whales were gone, all of a sudden there was way more krill than there ever was, and that was probably really helping and benefiting some of these species that were coming down there, especially the Adelies who've been down there. They're like, yeah, more food. But now that the whales are coming back, eating a lot of the krill, there's a lot of people fishing for krill within the last 30 years, 40 years, and the sea ice is melting. This has been really problematic for a staple of their diet. Now, when are we going to get to the good news? Can't give a talk like this and have it be all doom and gloom. So what I'm going to tell you here is, we've been talking very specifically about this little geographical location because the effects of climate change have been so severe there, and so many eyes are down there every year that everyone is seeing. It's really visible. But other places around, like the western Antarctic ice sheets and around this direction where very few people are going, except for scientists, actually seen that there's been even more sea ice than normal. And there are as many Adelies being born and nesting pairs in this area to make up for all of the ones that have not been doing so well in the peninsula. Now, that is a wee consolation prize for our westerns, or for our stock in the Western Peninsula. But some people have been saying, some people have some very negative outlook for that population and for the future. But I don't want you guys to be all depressed. Penguins are wonderful. Question?
Well, the map says 2002. Is that still true that there's more pack ice present longer?
Yep.
Years later?
Compared to the rest, if you come back here, you'll see even here that there's portions, and this is just from this year's satellite image, where there is more ice. Now, sea ice has fluctuated. It has fluctuated for as long as humans have been going down there. Tales of Shackleton, you know, some years, some explorers were able to go down and push really far down south, and they're like, we're awesome! I can't believe all these other explorers have failed! And then they go back down 3 years later and they don't make it, you know, within, you know, a number of degrees of where they had been. Famously, there was a Norwegian whaler in Stromness who had told Shackleton, he's like, this is some of the worst ice conditions anyone's ever seen, don't go down there. And he's like, I'm not listening to you, you go down there all the time. And away he went. I don't know how well that ended up for crew of the Endurance, but sea ice does fluctuate pretty dramatically. However, that is, yep, looking at averages. And this has been looking at, this is just a graphic to show that things are doing well, but even in the most recent State of the Antarctic Penguins report, it talks about how well the Adelies have been doing in other parts of the peninsula. So, if what I have spoken to you guys about today has piqued your curiosity and you want to know more about this subject matter, I encourage you guys to read. Bill Fraser was the man that I had mentioned. This guy spent somewhere now around 30, 40, maybe more years down at Palmer Station, which is located in the Western Antarctic, the Western Peninsula, on the southern tip of Anvers Island. And most of the theories in regard to the population of Adelies in that part of the world have come from that man right there. This book is not written by Bill Fraser, but it is about Fraser's penguins. It was written by one of the people that went down there helping him with his research one year, and she, I believe it was a she, really kind of was blown away by how passionate that man was about the subject matter and the work that he was doing, and so she wrote a book about his research. Fraser's penguins. And then Ron Naveen has headed up this, which is called Oceanites, and then he's also been pretty integral in this MAPPPE mapping, which we'll see here in just a second. Boop. And you can go and follow along in all of his research. Every single one of these little blue dots is an Adelie penguin colony that they have been gathering research upon. You can pull up this map. You can search it by species. You can search it by location, by name, and I encourage you guys to go home and have a play around with that map, because it's pretty entertaining, and you can learn about a lot of the sites where these animals breed. And it's not just Adelies that they have on there. They have the Gentoos, they have the chin straps. I think they have some of the macaronis and the emperors as well. But Oceanites is constantly sending scientists down on the tourism boats that go down there. They're also sending people down to some of the research stations, and they hop off and they go walk around and they do penguin counts of all of the breeding pairs. And then all of that information gets compiled into these State of the Antarctic Penguin reports. So if you guys want some light reading, you can peruse those. And then if for more information about the plight of the krill, stay tuned for the next lecture. No. You guys can read this, The Curious Life of Krill. There's lots of information out there. So some of the people I wanted to thank were a number of these ornithologists that I've had the pleasure to work with. These people have taught me a huge amount about not just this, but identifying birds, and not just in Antarctica, but all parts all over the world. You've got Lars over there to the left, Clouds in the middle, Noah Stryker. So you guys might know this name. He's become a pretty famous birder. He did the first big year that was a global or annual, or sorry, a world over big year. Andy, this man's absolutely wonderful, and my favorite birding companion, Toyo, down here. He never leaves home without his binoculars, loves birding. Yeah. I'll leave you with another quote by absolutely Cherry Gerard. All the world loves a penguin. And I think it's because in so many respects they're like ourselves, and in some respects they are what we should like to be. Possibly the best cure for a bad day or depression is just watch penguins exist. They're so ridiculous. So with that, knowing that I'm not a scientist, are there any questions? Question.
Is all the tourism there limited to the peninsula, or do people go around?
It's not limited to the peninsula, but by virtue of the fact that it takes about 5 days and a particular ice-strengthened hull ship to be able to get to the other parts of the world, it's really limited the number of boats that run out of New Zealand and down to the Ross Sea. Some do it. There's a number of them that leave every year. Some of them can't get through the ice and don't actually ever see the Ross ice sheet and don't ever make it to any of the locations where Shackleton would have gone down, and they get turned around so that they don't become like some of those very famous ships. You know, it's a roll of the dice how you're going to get those sea days for those 5 days. Previous to about 3 or 4 years ago, when they started building new really nice ice-strengthened ships, the only ones that were in existence were these old Russian boats, which were not used for tourism, but they were slapping people in them, and they would literally have seatbelts onto the bunks for some of those nights at sea. And I've heard some of the stories of people going down there, and they would never do it again. But yeah, with the vast majority of boats are going down to the peninsula.
So they just go to the peninsula and tool around there, and they don't go anywhere past there?
So there are different itineraries that are out there. If we go way back. Some of them will come into here, although this is usually choked off with ice, and because there's a big gyre in here which pushes ice in this general direction, there's an island down here called Snow Hill, which is the closest emperor penguin colony that anyone can really get to unless you go into the Ross Sea. And if you time it right in the beginning of the season and you have a helicopter, you can take a boat in here as long as the ice doesn't trap you in and fly people out to look at the emperor penguins. That's how most people will ever see an emperor, because the rest of the time they're breeding and on the ice in the middle of winter in boats. Nor people want to go down there. Unless you want to pull an absolute Cherry Gerard. Another great book, great read, worst journey in the world they used to build them differently back then, the peoples. Some of them come down here below the Antarctic Circle, down into this zone, but for them, and then a number of them head up to the Falklands and over to South Georgia, which is not on the screen. But yeah, a lot of them hang around in that peninsula area. Worth heading down if you've never been. Question here?
What's your purpose when you go back?
What's my purpose?
Yep, what are you going to do down there?
Take good folk like you and show you guys how incredible that place is, and yeah, teach you guys about it, and so that hopefully you'll have an interest in loving and protecting it and its creatures. Me personally, I work as a sea kayak guide, but yeah, that's because I love paddling.
Do you give these presentations at night? Like this, was this one that you...
I've never actually given this presentation before. You guys are the first and only people to ever hear it. I sort of winging it.
You did great.
Thanks.
Well, do you do presentations though?
Most of the presentations I do, I generally stay away from the presentations. Those go to people like Jacob, you know, the marine mammal specialists, and you know, usually there's an ornithologist on there, and my interests are usually marine mammals and birds, and there's usually someone else whose sole job is to give those presentations. So in the evening time, we'll give short presentations somewhere around like 3 to 5 or 7 minutes on something that we'd seen that day, and so sometimes I'll give those, but most of the presentations I do are telling people what the kayaking program is going to be like. When I used to work in Southeast Alaska for a company called Uncruise, and I would give presentations similar to this about Southeast Alaska. But no, for the most part, I don't do too many of these presentations anymore. Other questions? No? One question that's not being asked is
Can you just take a quick
my personal
point
favorite.
on one of those maps? Where the Yeah,
Yep.
Is these penguins just a chimp?
Nobody asked this question. Yep. Disguised though he may be. Yep, that's a chin strap on Half Moon Island. Yep. So these guys will share duty of incubating. So the female will go out and the male will sit there with his little. They've kind of got like a little exposed patch of skin under them feathers, and so he kind of like scoops the eggs over, and it's called a brood pouch. And so he kind of like hunkers down, and because he's there, he's kind of got to do his business in the nest, and then he's kind of got to like get down and keep the egg warm. And so if you catch him when they're leaving the nest to like head to replace the female or the male, they have this look of shame on them, and they wear it proudly. I think he just looks so ashamed.
Did I miss this, or did you share like the population, the numbers of these?
I didn't.
Okay.
Because it's so specific to the western like the western peninsula, but the I think it actually might say
Like if someone's on your tour, are they going to see hundreds of these, or are they going to see?
Oh yeah, so
Okay.
so here on the left is the Adeles, and this is number of breeding pairs. So if you look, these are the thousands of breeding pairs.
Right.
These are in the hundreds. So these are the chin straps and the, sorry, that information didn't make it onto the slide. So chin straps and gentoos, 200 pairs, 400 pairs, 600 pairs, up to 1,000 pairs. Even at its lowest, it's still just barely below 5,000 breeding pairs for Adeles. So the purple line is in reference to this number over on the left side. And again, these have changed. So it's been about a 65% decline in Adelie penguins, and the rise of the gentoo and the chin strap is they're not so much out competing the Adelies for nesting space. They're not like kicking them out, taking their nests, like I kind of jokingly described in the gentification. But what they are doing is they're just setting up shop in different nesting zones and doing fairly well themselves. There was another question that was over here. It was regarding a map.
I was just asking because I'm not just where the research areas are of Antarctica.
Like where the research stations are?
Yeah.
Oh man. So if we go right back, there is one joint U.S. and Russian base right there at the South Pole. If you were to look up the kind of geopolitics of Antarctica is really wild, and it's broken into a number of different nations. I think there's somewhere around 12 or 17 nations that actually have like slices. It's kind of broken up into a big pie. But just in the peninsula alone is got to be, I don't know, would you say like 12 or 14 different research stations. The Argentinians and the Chileans have a number of research stations, but they're really just down there to be like, we're present because this land is close to us. There's a couple of different British ones, including a big one south of right around Adelaide, and then Palmer Station is right here in the very southern end of Anvers. There's Vernadsky, which is a Ukrainian base that's down there that's right south of Anvers as well. There's tons of different research bases. The Scott base and the most popular, the most famous U.S. base, McMurdo, are down in the Ross Sea, and those are kind of like over. Where are they? They're down in like this zone next to the Ross Ice Shelf. Yeah, so there's like tons and tons of research stations down there. And then there's other boats just doing research in and
I
around.
just didn't know whether they were more focused on the same place where people go down.
There are a bunch down there, including Port Lockroy, which is a British research station, and also a post office. You might have seen videos or photos of that. So there's a research station component as well as a post office. You can send postcards from Antarctica. It's pretty cool. The trips can be wildly expensive, which is why I got down there the way I got down there, which was to try and find someone who would pay me to go down there. But if you guys are ever really wanting to go down, here's the secret. Are you ready? you head down to Ushuaia in Argentina, and you have maybe a month's worth of time, and you have cash, and you sit there and you go up to the boats and you're like, hey, you got a open space? Because I got cash. And there'll be open berths that will otherwise go without anyone, and that they will take substantially less to go down there, because you'll still make it more profitable than if they don't go down there. So that's the secret. If you guys ever want to go down and you don't want to foot that bill, because I can understand that. It would never have, I would probably never have been able to get down there myself.
What does it cost?
Depends. There's a number of different options. On the really bougie, swanky, high-end, 6-star luxury yacht things, those can be around, I think, somewhere in the order of 20 to 50 grand a stateroom. For it's usually the trips, if they're leaving out of the Antarctic, if they're leaving and they're crossing the Drake, it's usually 2 days across the Drake, and then 6 to 10 days of actually like in the Antarctic Peninsula area, and you're usually 2 activities a day, weather permitting, walking around, going for a Zodiac cruise, and then it's back across. So depending on the length and the amount of time that you're down there, it depends a bit on the cost. And then on the cheaper side of things, probably like 5 grand a head to go down there. And what I'll say is the place is probably the closest you'll get to being on a foreign planet while still being in not like above water in this world. It's absolutely mind-blowing and worth it if you ever have the opportunity to go down, by all means. Any other questions? I'll hang around and linger if you guys want to come up and chat. But yes, one more.
While you have the map up,
Yes.
can you point out the Thwaites Glacier? Is it next to the Ross Ice Shelf? That's the one that's been in the news because when the Ross melts and no longer holds the Thwaites and it slides into the sea, global sea level goes up by 200 feet.
So the Ross ice sheet is a long way away from being gone. So the Ross is down here, and I don't even think it's necessarily like really well represented in this, because I think it just does go like across this. So it's somewhere, it would be somewhere in that general region, but I don't know exactly where it is. I've not been down to that part. I would love to go someday, mainly just to go see the penguins down in these little islands. Like any true birder, I'm out to try and see all of them. I'm just missing the Galapagos, the snares, the erect crested, and the royal. And those basically could all be seen, well, outside of the little Galapagos, could all be seen by leaving out of southern New Zealand and going down to all those little colorful dots right down there. Also very difficult to get down to with really heinous and awful weather. That's my birding stick. Yeah, when Kim first approached me to do this lecture, she's like, do you want to give a talk? And I was like, sure. And she's like, yeah, it's great. Just you go places and you take photos of birds and just like talk to people about birds. And I was like, I can't just stand up here and be like, I like birds. Here are photos of birds. And then she's like, no, you totally can do that. And I was like, I don't know if I feel comfortable doing that. And so this was, I figured at least make it educational. So hopefully you guys learned something.